Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the third and final day of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. We have quite the lineup today, and before I start, I'll just quickly go over the agenda for today's meeting. We have Dr. Gry Hasselbalch briefing on the data ethics of power, a global approach to big data and the AI era. Then we have Robert Gordon talking about the cyber landscape in the new Cold War. We have Emma O'Connor, who's the Chief Data Officer for Employment and Service Development Canada, Data Strategy Implementation, a major government department. Then we have Eric Sweden, who's coming to us from the National Association of State CIOs, talking about the states and their perspective to drive digital acceleration. In the afternoon, we have three streams: the cyber stream, the artificial intelligence and knowledge management stream, and then we have the interoperability and privacy workshops. The latter is going to have Dr. Brill talk about the European interoperability reference architecture, and then we're going to have perspectives on progress and digital identity by Joni Brennan and François Bédard, who are head of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. So it's going to be a very interesting day. Remember, all sessions are going to be recorded. Okay, for that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gry Hasselbalch. She's an author and a scholar specialized in the powers and interests of big data and the artificial intelligence era. She's co-founded the European think tank DataEthics.eu in 2015 and is research director at DataEthics.eu Times Research. She's a member of the European Union high-level expert group on artificial intelligence and coined terms such as trustworthy artificial intelligence and contributed directly to the EU's AI strategy. Today, she's a research lead and senior key expert on AI ethics in the international outreach for a human-centric approach to artificial intelligence, intouchai.eu. She's also leading the Data Pollution and Power Initiative at the University of Bonn's Institute of Science and Ethics Sustainable AI Lab. She's author of the critically acclaimed book, Data Ethics and Power, a human approach in the big data and artificial intelligence era. And note that she's got her PhD, from the University of Copenhagen in data ethics. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Gry. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Bob. Let me start by sharing my screen 1 second. And I'm also very delighted to be here as well. So let me 1 second. There we go. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. So I just want to start this debate or this presentation. I have caught you I know I have 40 minutes to speak, but I'm speaking from Copenhagen, and I know even though it's a virtual conference, then I just want to start by congratulating Canada and Denmark for actually finding and agreeing this Tuesday on kind of a border and a division of this little island between Canada and Greenland, actually, the Hans Island. So this is a great, way of peaceful negotiation in a time where things can be more complicated, about struggles about land, and very problematic indeed. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a different kind of competition, a different kind of struggle also, which is very much about what we could call socio-technical spaces and infrastructures that have evolved out of this digitization processes that we're talking about at this conference. And I'm going to talk to you focusing mostly on what we could call a big data and AI era, where dominance and power is mostly expressed in technology design and technology cultures and practices. So right now, some of you might know this picture. This is not the original one, of course, for copyright reasons, but this is the Magritte picture painting, or of course, a copy of the Magritte painting, where it says "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." which of course he's referring to the idea that not everything is as it appears to be. And this is really interesting when we talk about digitization, and this big data AI era, because right now we have a competition at a regional and a global level to gain what some would call like a technological momentum, where we have these local systems that are evolving into larger, more integrated global systems. And we have a competition playing out in front of our eyes between different technological systems and styles of scientists and entrepreneurs, requirements and expectations from users, investors, and lawmakers, different systems with different values. And of course, when we look at digital technologies, when we look at our phones and our computers and these things, then this is what we see. We see a computer and we see a phone, but of course, there's a huge systems of behaviors, of cultures, of values behind, and that are invested in these technologies. Technologies are, of course, not neutral. They are created in context of cultural negotiations and power negotiations. So, of course, when we talk about digitalization and digital transformation, we're not just, as I say, talking about cables and digits. It's not just this. We're not just going from manual to digital. We're not just talking about these shiny new technologies. Nothing is as it appears to be. We are talking about cultural transformations, about power in society and negotiation of interests. So today, what I really want you to think about is really the kind of different values and different power interests that are behind the technologies that we're using in our everyday lives. So I'm going to focus on this transformation of power in what I call the big data and AI era. I'll also look at specifically what I call socio-technical infrastructures of power, the big data infrastructures of power, and the AI socio-technical infrastructures of power. Those are the ones I'm talking about in my last book. And what I also want to present is, if we have certainly a certain kind of situation now in terms of our digital technologies, we have socio-technical infrastructures of you could say asymmetries of power between citizens, between big companies, between states and citizens. And of course, we need to shape this development in a certain way. And so there's a lot of governance initiatives worldwide. Particularly, it went from looking at data protection. For example, now I'm from the EU and from Europe, and we've had the big general data protection legislation reform, which has been implemented over some years now. And now we're moving on to these conversations about AI, the AI Act. And those are basically also global conversations of one particular part of our transformations. And so how do we, if we really want to shape these technical, socio-technical infrastructures that we have in our everyday lives for democracy, for example, for equality, for diversity, then how do we do this? And this is something that I think that this is where actually we both need a historical perspective. We need to understand where we are in a historical context. And we also need a very specific view on what do we want right now. And right now, of course, this is one thing that I also want to talk about. We hear very much the term the human-centric approach. Of course, it's not a new approach when we look about the design of not only artificial intelligence, but design of technologies in general. But what it's right now is that there's also this kind of governance approach, which is much broader than only the design approach. And then lastly, what is it that we want? Of course, if we can think about infrastructures that I said before, that in some way have an embedded form of asymmetry of power. But what we really want is socio-technical infrastructures of human empowerment. Infrastructures where we as citizens have access, understanding, where we feel empowered by the technologies we use. So I want to start with, to include this historical perspective, I want to start with two stories that are almost, that are really many years apart. So in one day in 1940, a world famous philosopher, some of you might know him, it's Henri Bergson, French philosopher. He went to register at a police station in Paris. And as a person of Jewish descent, he was actually required to do so because of these anti-Semitic laws that had just been introduced in France after its German occupation. And so when he was there at the police station and he was completing this registration form, Bergson, he wrote in the form, and I quote, academic, philosopher, Nobel Prize winner, Jew. Now, 80 years later in 2020, in a completely different part of the world, a man named Robert Julian Borchak Williams, he was arrested for a crime he actually didn't commit because of an incorrect match that had been done between a picture of his face and the one of a criminal by a facial recognition system. Now, in 2020, these kind of facial recognition systems, they had actually been used by police forces in the US, where he was based, for more than 2 decades. And many of these had often been exposed to reinforce racial bias. So when he was presented with this grainy picture of this criminal, which was a black man like himself, his first reaction was, of course, to ask, do you think that all black men look the same? Now, these data systems that I've talked about now, 2 different times, 2 different periods in history, of course, shows that data systems to make sense of and to organize and control life in society, they've always existed throughout history. And often we've seen that they've had devastating consequences for people. They've also transformed throughout history. So today we have this conversion of everything into data. We have an extra layer of life and society that I think we really need to think about with a very particular kind of reflection. It needs a very particular kind of awareness from us. So if we take, for example, the data system of Bergson and Williams, and we compare them, they of course both reinforce ethnic bias in society, and their human consequences were very problematic. But there's also really tiny differences between them, because the philosopher, of course, the Bergson, he of course he couldn't choose the system, but he could choose the data, which was a really tiny rebellion against this data system of power that he was up against. Mr. Williams, on the other hand, his data, it was chosen for him. Actually, he wasn't even aware that he had been registered in this data system that was now being used against him by the police. So here in the 2020s, 2022, we're not just challenged by a database and register of a dominant regime of power. We're actually also submerged in these socio-technical data systems of power. And this is, of course, something we need to think about. So today we have big data and AI systems. They represent different power relations. So this is an example of, this is a study by Biography et al. And others from 2016. They looked at word clusters that were created within these very particular uses of, it's called word embedding methods that you use when you create, for example, search engines like Google search engines. And when you create these, you of course train them, and these were trained on Google News articles, for example. And so they realized that when these systems were being created, they would actually cluster words like very extreme, as they say, she words like nurse and homemaker and receptionist, and they would also cluster other words in very extreme he occupations, as they said, maestro, skipper, architect, director, and things like this. And of course, then when you search online, you have these reinforced power relations and biases being reinforced in your searches. So this is one thing. These big data analysis, that they represent very particular power dynamics in society. They also reinforce them. This is a study by the Harvard professor Latanya Sweeney. And she made this study in 2013 where she looked at ads in also search engines, and where she could say that looking at how these ads were delivered when you searched, she tried to use in 2,000 184 searches she did, where she looked at across 2 different websites. She looked at racially associated personal names, and she said that these would usually be associated with crimes and criminal activity. So these systems that we have, they also reinforce, for example, something like racial bias in society. And then we have the systems that enact power dynamics in society. So here we have the female pediatrician who's been locked out of a gym room because the system, the computer system, basically doesn't recognize the word doctor as a female. So when she's trying, she was signed in the system as a doctor, it was recognizing her as a man. And so she's locked out of the locker room in a gym. This is a kind of a minor thing, but there's also the very famous study called the COMPAS study, where the journalist, the investigative journalist, Julia Angren, she looked at this COMPAS algorithm that was used for in the US judicial system to assess the likelihood of recidivism after release of defendants. And she found, and they found actually, that bias, there was a bias in the algorithm that had a tendency to designate Black defendants as possible re-offenders twice as often as it did with white defendants. So these systems also enact powers in society. So basically what I'm arguing here is that we can look at these technologies, as I said, as cables and digits and phones and computers, but we also have to think about them as infrastructures. So they're infrastructures, they're spaces that we're living in, they have appearances, but they're also very material, they have a design, they're constructed, they have an architecture where different citizens or where different actors in societies are placed and have different forms of powers. And of course, these infrastructures, as I said before, they also tell certain stories, just like bridges and roads and buildings. They tell stories when they break down. So, for example, this is an example of the Genoa Bridge that you might remember. Unfortunately, it collapsed some years ago. Many people lost their homes. Many people died in the collapse. And after that, many stories came out about how was this bridge built? What was the myth? There was an Italian myth about pride, about building these kinds of constructions. There was an architect that had built it, and we saw how this bridge was built. I'll get back to that point because that's a really, really important point when we talk about socio-technical infrastructures, these infrastructures, digital infrastructures I was talking about before, because we are in a moment right now where we suddenly see the cracks in these infrastructures. We see there's problems in terms of data protection. We hear surveillance scandals, hacks, and so things. But I'll get back to these because I want to talk about 3 different kinds of infrastructures here. That are built on big data or respectively, because they also have a history, or have increasingly also AI capabilities. So the first kind of big data socio-technical infrastructure that I'd like to talk to you about is this that I call the BDSTIs, the big data socio-technical infrastructures. And they're digital infrastructures. They're cutting across societies, across geographic territories. They have across legal jurisdictions, across different cultures, across different societies. And they are in part institutionalized. They have systems requirements, standards for information technologies, practices, and also in laws, as I said, I mentioned the GDPR. But they are also invested with what we could say, as I said, and I get back to this about values and the values of technologies. They're also invested with human imagination about the challenges and opportunities of, for example, when we talk about big data, about big data. So if we think about for example, the EU's digital single market that, among others, is realized in these digital data structures, we can think about that as a kind of imagination that is invested in building these infrastructures. Or we can think about the imagination of the digital or the scientists and the entrepreneurs that sees big data, and also businesses, this big data economy that sees big data as this resource that, as Maya Schoenberg and Kukia in their famous book describe it like, is unlike any other resources. It's unbounded, it's unlimited. It's not like oil and water that can run out. We have unbounded resources here. And so what's important with this big data socio-technical infrastructures, what is important to note here is that that critical societal functions are increasingly organized around these BDSTIs, as I call them. And so to design and shape these infrastructures is also a very essential form of power. And for example, surveillance powers of states and industries are embedded in these infrastructures. And they're a key property of their design and their architecture. And I'll get back to this point. But let's for a moment go on to the next kind of infrastructure of power that I like to talk about, which is the AI socio-technical infrastructures of power. So of course, the history of AI and its scientific and social and philosophical underpinnings, it's really long and it's complex. And of course, we have to think of, the way I like to think about it is that if we think about the AI at the moment, the way it looks in very practical terms, and I'm not talking about sentient AI, as we've heard a global debate about, or at the moment, I'm talking about the ones that are in our everyday life with sensing capabilities and these things. And so these AI socio-technical infrastructures that we have now in our everyday life, they're constituted as big data socio-technical infrastructure because they need data to be trained and to evolve. But they're different because they're designed to sense the environment in real time. They're learning and they're evolving with autonomous or semi-autonomous agency. And so let me give you some examples where we see these very ordinary AI infrastructures. We have them in the public sector. So for example, now I come from the EU, but for example, in the European countries, we see a lot of strategies lately being created to integrate AI in public institutions to develop, for example, personalized assistants, chatbots, and conversational platforms. And also we have actually seen socially scoring application for socially scoring families and tracing vulnerable children. We've also seen applications for automating civil service tasks, predictive policing, fraud detection. That's in the public sector. If you look at the financial sector, we have, for example, seen how finance has been transformed with what we call cyborg finance, where humans and machines, they kind of share the power of creating the system. So for example, 80% of transactions on the Forex market, this is where the world currencies are traded, were performed by robots. This was in 2019 when I found these numbers. And we have robot advisors for financial advice, for investment management. We have financial institutions that are using AI applications for market analysis and to assess credit quality and price loan contracts, and so many other things. For social networking, we know social networking systems, or every one of us, many are using Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all these social networking sites. And most of these, the most common social networking services that we know, for example, provided by Facebook and Google, are using AI systems to provide personalized ranking and recommendations, to analyze words and phrases of search queries, and to decide what other words have the same meaning. They also use them to provide facial recognition to track users in photos. They use them to understand and respond to conversations, or to detect, for example, misinformation and illegal and what is also called harmful content on these portals. In healthcare, I'm going through a lot here because I just want to, in the middle where and some of you have probably heard that there's been a lot of conversation this week about AI that can think and needs rights and everything, but I think this is a diversion from what we should really look at, which is these AI socio-technical infrastructures of power, I'll add ISTs. So in healthcare, this is really important for the pandemic also. In healthcare, AI is used for decision-making in the probability of and estimation of diseases, for personalized medicines, illness monitoring and treatment planning, critical care, diagnosis, treatment decisions, and triage even. And then we have the smart cities, and I'll get back to a few concrete examples here, but we have smart cities. We have cities that are transformed with internet connected things, with sensors that collect data in real time. And AI is integrated here into city management and into engineering and construction to analyze distribution in real time and centralize data from various urban components. So there's a lot of really interesting applications right now and real life applications of AI that is shaping the space that we're moving around in. But what's really important, I think, when we talk about these big data socio-technical infrastructures, the BDSDIs and the ISTs, is that while BDSDIs act in space by transforming everything into data that we can then act on, then IST actually, they also act in time. I don't know if you understand what I mean here, but so we have a space that is being created virtually out of data. And then at the same time, what these AI capabilities do is that they take all this data in the present time with a certain purpose, a future purpose, and they shape the present in the image of this future purpose. So they have a very concrete influence on this. Actually, I would say sometimes taking some of the dynamism, the movement out of these more vivid spaces that we are in normally. Then the third kind of infrastructure, the socio-technical infrastructure that I want to talk about is, of course, the most important one. This is what we want. This is what we have to work towards, which is the one where I call them the human socio-technical infrastructures of empowerment. I mentioned them before. And so, of course, we have to think of these three powers as competing forms of powers, three infrastructures that are competing right now. This last third kind of power or infrastructure of empowerment is one that really promotes human empowerment. It's one where you could think of the human environment as basically qualitatively different from these very rigid AI and big data infrastructures, where we have dynamic qualities, where we want to have access to, for example, our data. We want to be empowered to use these technologies in our way. We don't want black boxes, as Frank Pasquale, the professor Frank Pasquale calls it, where we don't have access and don't understand how our data, for example, is used, or where suddenly we realized that they're being used against us, like Mr. Williams, the man that was that went actually and slept overnight in prison. Because he was being mismatched with his face by a facial recognition system that made a mistake. So these different kinds of infrastructures we want to have that are different. They are different in design, but they're also different in the way they're implemented in society. And I'll get back to that now. So let's take two examples, for example. And it's the easiest way to understand this is with examples. So the first example I want to use is from Barcelona, which was one of the first European smart city initiatives to implement data-driven smart city technologies. So the city invested a lot in developing this extensive IoT network, sensor network, collected data about transportation, about energy and air quality. It included also a bicycle sharing system with 6,000 bicycles, wireless sensors that goes underneath the roads to guide drivers to available parking spots, all very useful. Waste management systems with smart data collecting bins and smart lighting where sensors detect when lights are required. And for example, saving energy and reducing the heat generated by old lamps, you really use these infrastructures for a lot of positive change in society. And one of them is, of course, in the connection with climate change. But one thing we have to think about a city like this is it's, of course, an immense network of data. It includes data on people also, and it senses and it acts on this mobile environment, mostly something a person that moves through the city doesn't see or feel. But it's something that all big actors with an interest in data do see very clearly. So we have the commercial actors with an interest in using data to, for example, personalize or train and better their services. We have scientists with an interest in improving results with data. We have state actors that wants to make services and processes more efficient and to control the city in certain ways. And so there's really a lot of different interests in data. And the main risk, of course, here you can imagine, based on what I've been presented before, is that there's the risk here that there's only a few interests, and those of the most powerful, that are met in the very data design, the very design of an infrastructure like this. But with Barcelona, it's different because in 2015, there was a new mayor, took the smart city initiative in a new direction. So she wanted to develop this data infrastructure for and by people, as she said. So Barcelona today, it has actually what we call a digital transformation agenda that views data as a commons. So for example, it opens up data to help the city's entrepreneurial ecosystem. We have SMEs in the ICT sector and empowering citizens and with tools that let people selectively disclose the information they want to share. So Barcelona is all together with Amsterdam, for example. Also, they were, because this study or this project is actually over, but the European project called the Decode project, they were pilots for developing tools that citizens can use and choose how and with who they want to share their data. And so this is also what we call data trust and personal data stores, but that's a different thing. The point is that this is one particular infrastructure of power where we see power and data and digital infrastructures being in the hands of people. This is another system, another case, just to show a different kind of infrastructure. So here we have the centralized city brain AI data system, which was developed by the privacy or by the Chinese tech giant Alibaba, which monitors every vehicle in the city of Hangzhou in China. And so while it has helped to reduce traffic jams by 15%, it has also done a lot of other things. So the system also constantly monitors video footage of traffic. It looks out for signs of collisions or accidents in order to alert the police. It combines data from the Transportation Bureau, from the public transportation systems, a mapping app, and hundreds of thousands of cameras and road accidents are, for example, now automatically detected so they can be responded to much faster. And illegal parking is tracked live. So of course, it can also do a lot of things than only this. The interests in this centralized data city of City Brain are, of course, also really big here, just like Barcelona, they're big, but they're more concentrated to a few power actors. So City Brain does not, for example, have a city oversight or control. No one benefits of the huge amount of data that is generated apart from these few power actors. We have the law enforcement, we have the government, we have Alibaba. And so, of course, the implications for, in particular, citizen privacy are huge in this system. So you see the difference between two different kind of socio-technical infrastructures of power, as I call them. Right now, we have at the moment, and I mentioned it a little bit before, we've had conversations in society about data protection. It's moved on to a conversation in the policy field, in particular in geopolitics on AI. So we have competing powers right now trying to decide different approaches to AI and data, competing, as I said before, about this technological momentum momentum that I talked about. And it's of course a competition in very real terms for economic powers, but it's also about cultural power. Some are even talking about digital and AI colonialism now. So that's something to be very aware of. While we have in Europe, we have an AI Act proposal being negotiated, and we have different kinds of negotiation also across with like-minded countries about different principles, different policy approaches, different strategies on how to build these socio-technical infrastructures. I'll be a little bit fast and go across this because I know my time is not as long as I can always keep talking, but I just wanted to bring out, I talked about the technological momentum and this idea of the historical context. So the technological momentum was a term that was coined by Thomas P. Hughes, and he talked about different phases of socio-technical change, but when technological systems, the large one, they transform from these local regional systems into larger, for example, global systems. He looked at the electric power systems and analyzed this. And he talked about different phases. He talked about the phase of invention and development. The first phase that is dominated by investors and entrepreneurs that are the key drivers of change. And he talks about the next phase, which is transfer, where we have this focus moving away from this invention phase into this transferring the technology across borders, across regions, across sectors also. Then we have the growth moment in third phase, where we have different actors, many different actors, from entrepreneurs, inventors, engineers, lawmakers, and so on and so forth, that are looking to find solutions for problems we've seen. Like things like, as I talked before, when these infrastructures suddenly break down and we see there's problems there and we try to fix them. And what we all what these big kind of different phases are leading to is this fourth phase that we can talk about, which is the technological momentum that I mentioned several times, which is all about creating a momentum for a very particular way of creating a technology to create a socio-technical infrastructure, for example. And so when we look at the different examples I showed now, we can see that we are actually in a very important moment right now, where we have different options, different futures, different narratives about how these socio-technical infrastructures should look in our everyday life. Who should they empower? What kind of society do we want them to emphasize, and to what kind of powers do we want them to represent, to reinforce and reenact, as we saw at first? Democratic powers or monopolistic powers, or maybe totalitarian powers? Of course, I'm rooting for the democratic approach. That's quite obvious from this talk. And so again, as I said before, we have this moment when infrastructures break down and narratives of power and interest become visible. I'm not going to go through this. Another point that I wanted to get to here is this idea of ethics, because ethics becomes very visible. The values of what we're doing, the existential questions regarding what kind of society do we want to live in, is something that becomes very present in these kind of moments of negotiations of powers, as I talked about before. And actually, in 1985, the professor James H. Moore, he wrote this article about what is computer ethics, and he talked about the computer revolution, and he said we would get to, at some point, the permeation stage, the stage where we're really in the middle of these technologies, where we'll ask questions regarding the nature and value of things. And so right now we have a moment, as I said, we talk about the machine as such. When we talk about AI, for example, this AI moment we have right now, we're talking about ethics by design, about machine ethics, about value sensitive design. So how do we build the very technologies? How do we design the technologies to support certain values? We also have questions about the humans, the relations between people, the relations between the doctor and the patient that are using an AI tool. We have bigger, grander conversations about culture and society. Those are the ones I've talked about the most in this presentation, where we talk about power dynamics, about geopolitics, about cultural paradigms, about scientific paradigms, even in how we develop these technologies. And then there's the existential questions. Actually, that's really relevant, funny that we actually have this conversation about, can a machine think, can it be emotional? Those are not new conversations, but they're relevant now because we're starting to fear how much power are we letting go of into black box systems where we actually feel powerless in terms of the decisions that are made about us, the decisions that are made in society. And so, again, as I said, we're in this moment between growth and momentum. We are in what we call a policy vacuum. That's what James 8 Moore called, one where infrastructure and ethics become actually one as a position in the global debate. And so there's a lot of principles at the moment being, and I just want to draw attention to some of them here at the end of the talk. There's a lot of principles being created on AI, for example. How should we build technologies? What role should play it? Based on very often on fundamental rights, luckily, and human rights. And so the key principles at the moment that I just want to draw the attention to now is the OECD principles on artificial intelligence, the EU AI high-level expert groups ethics guidelines that have been translated into the AI Act at the moment, which are the ones that I was part of developing. And I have to say, I didn't coin the term trustworthy AI, but we in the group coined the term trustworthy AI. And the UNESCO recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence. I'll recommend everyone to look into it. The EU guideline is, of course, my point of departure. There is 3 principles. Lawful AI has to be lawful, it has to be ethical, it has to be robust, and there's the requirements in an assessment list. And also the International Outreach Initiative. But I think this is basically few words just about what's coming next. Just to round off this presentation, I think there's a few things we have to remember now. We of course need a new imagination and narrative. So we need a different kind of culture, around human power and how we build technologies. We need to think very specifically in design terms. So we need to think about the technical components of these infrastructures of empowerment I talked about. And education, of course, is really important. Law, which is being developed right now. And in the very end, we also need, what I always promote is, of course, we need the right voices in this narrative of change. We need a diverse debate where we're not only speaking from, for example, a Western point of view. We need to include, for example, the global South voices, people in communities that are being most exposed to these data systems of power. And I think with that said, I just want to say thank you for the presentation, for listening to me, and I'm going to stop sharing now, and I think I'm spot on almost 40 minutes. I told you about that I am very good with time, so thank you for listening, and it's been a real pleasure to be invited for this talk.
Well, thank you very much, Gry. It was great hearing you. And sorry, just make sure that, okay, good. It was a very good presentation, very solid. I have a couple of questions for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we'll just go through. The first one is, how many practitioners have a solid understanding of both the technology and the social implications? And are universities really addressing these issues?
Well, I mean, there's a big debate about that at the moment. And I think one of the things, for example, we've had all the global development in different global force of principles. And very often it's understood as very high level and far-fetched from the actual reality where you're sitting and developing, for example, AI. And one thing that is not aware, so the tradition is, of course, as a computer scientist or an AI practitioner, you have very concrete tasks, and you have a system that you have to develop. It's very solution oriented, and very rarely you will actually be able to, and you don't even have the tools to understand the ethical and social implications of these, as I said, exactly the system as more than just a technical system, but as a socio-technical system. I think this getting at many universities I see, and especially at like computer science departments and things, we're seeing, especially in the educational part, more of this, including the social aspects and the ethical aspects. And there's also a lot of good initiatives that are helping with building tools that you can use in the process. For example, I've just been looking at, for example, tools to understand the impact of particular AI models on the environment in terms of carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. And I've seen several tools being developed right now that at least attempts to try to give the practitioner the ability to actually measure things like this.
No, thank you very much. No, that was a good response. I know at our university, at the University of Ottawa, we're working on multidisciplinary courses that basically address all of the issues. And we use capability-based planning, but to a large extent, you're dealing with a lot of the social issues in that. The face blindness is interesting, the example you gave in the class, because for example, Caucasian people, there's 99.99% verification, it works. However, for non-Caucasian, often there's a failure rate of about 20%. And it's interesting, just the concept of, you can have AIs, but they've got to be properly trained and put in place.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely critical. The next question I have is, actually, it's basically a compliment. It's a very rich and multi-dimensional presentation. People have really enjoyed, coming to the presentation for that. We have a lot of viewers for that. And the next question I have, and the last one, I'm afraid we can indulge ourselves in, aren't AI just neutral technologies? And really, they just mimic the human and do better than humans at certain tasks. Driverless cars, for example. Detection of cancer. In engineering, we've been using that validating aircraft frames. Isn't this all really about correcting human biases or taking into account human biases?
Well, it's a combination, of course, but the system in itself can have an embedded bias, even in the way you classify and categorize. So, of course, I mean, there's no technologies that are not human. So and that's one thing that's interesting also about this debate that I was referring to this week about this AI system that suddenly started. You probably have heard about it. Google engineer that started having a conversation, and he claimed that it was human, had personhood. I mean, that's a really dangerous debate, because in that way we somehow leave the responsibility away from ourselves. So the point is, I don't think we can talk about biased AI without talking about biased humans, of course. But that's why I'm always emphasizing that all of these systems are socio-technical, and they're human by default, no? So we created them with very specific cultures of design and different ways. I disagree that technologies are neutral, because they're designed with certain, based on certain scientific paradigms, the criteria, the very models, the very way of building a technology is very non-neutral. And that's where something like the science and technology studies perspective is really important, because you understand how there's different paradigms in how you build a technology. So I mean, it's not a clear-cut answer. It's not and that's also, if you think of bias as something that could be fixed only in the design, for example, then you have a problem, because of course you have to work on, for example, when you have as I mentioned, the word embedding methods that were trained on Google News articles that are just reinforcing already existing biases in society. If you don't work on the already existing bias in society, you have biased technologies. So it's a kind of circular movement in some way, no?
Well, thank you very much for the responses. I know the Canadian government, with the algorithmic impact assessments and the like, they're coming to grips with this. but a great deal of work has to be, more work has to be done in this particular area. Well, thank you very much, Gry, for your insights. I would recommend the book to anybody that wants to read on that. There's also another recent book put out by Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Daniel Huttenlocher, The Age of AI and Our Human Future, which is, it's a very digestible, quickly digestible book that you can go through, but it provides insights from multiple generations. And
which is important when you speak about diversity. Yeah.
But anyways, I would very much recommend the Data Ethics book by Gry. And with that, I am going to be ending this particular presentation. And I invite everybody to attend. Right now, we've got Robert Gordon going to be presenting. He was an ex-assistant deputy minister in the Canadian government in cyberspace. And thank you very much, Gry. And he's going to be talking about the cyber landscape in the new Cold War. So without further ado, thank you very much. And this will end this streaming session. Please go to the next one. Thank you.